Hey, everybody, welcome to Locker Room. This is Southland's podcast for men, where we try to redeem men's conversations. We try to talk about the right things in the right ways, and sometimes we achieve that goal, sometimes we don't. Who knows? But I'm joined today by my friend Kent Evans, so welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Glad to have you, dude. What are you doing?
I was taking notes.
What are you doing on that thing over there?
I didn't want to forget something.
It's intimidating.
I thought your intro was going to be longer.
No, man, it's brief. I just rattle it off,
And here's Kent.
Yeah, we had somebody else hosted last week, Scott Hatfield, or last time we recorded, and he did the intro, and he did a really good job. I think he practiced in front of the mirror, though.
Is that?
Yeah, I don't.
Over and over.
It just comes right out of me.
Let's take that again.
Welcome, man. I'm really glad you're here. Thanks for coming.
It's my pleasure.
Do you live in Louisville?
Louisville, Kentucky.
You're in Louisville. Okay, so you're not across the river in Indiana or anything like that. So.
Oh, goodness, no.
Yeah.
That's like, you need a passport for that.
That's right.
It's crazy.
Well, interestingly, so, this happens a lot to me as a pastor. People will say, hey, you need to meet so-and-so. They'll meet somebody and go, you really got to meet this guy. You're going to love him. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes.
There was that one time.
Sometimes it's funny. Not. And so I'm always a little bit suspicious. But anyway, I by the recommendation of a mutual friend, met you for coffee here in town not that long ago. Man, in all sincerity, like it was one of my most favorite meetings I've had in a long time, because I was just pleasantly surprised at how good of a conversation we had.
Fun.
I think we're really like-minded in a lot of ways, passionate about a lot of the same things. And so I kind of left there going, man, we got to have him on Locker Room if we possibly can. And so thanks for being willing.
Well, I was telling you, it's a trip down memory lane for me.
Yeah.
I was baptized at Southland Christian Church, 1991, 31 years ago this December. So, and I'm not sure, my wife and I were here today having lunch. I conned her into coming with me and making it a date, and we couldn't remember if we've even been back. Like, we were trying to figure out, did we come back for a wedding or something?
Sure.
I'm not sure. So it might have been about 30 years since I've been here.
So you were in school at UK, and, you started chasing a pretty girl, and she said, you got to come to church. Is that kind of how it went down?
That's exactly how it went down.
That's part of our evangelistic strategy. It has been for a long time, and it's really effective.
Extremely. God knew how to bait the hook, for sure. And so, April and I were driving here today. We've been married 27 years, and you fast forward, we have 5 sons. They're 22, 20, 18, 11, and 7, and 1 daughter-in-law. So, but it all started 30-something years ago on the campus of University of Kentucky.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being willing to give back a little bit to Southland by coming on the podcast today. And
I owe you guys so much. Well,
you just kind of gave the first indicator of why you might be on the podcast, just in saying, here's a dude who's got 5 sons.
Ooh.
Yeah. So that's got to be an incredible adventure. I mean, a lot of what you and I talked about at coffee that day was fatherhood, being a husband, being a dad, that kind of thing. And so maybe just talk a little bit about what is it, besides the fact that quite obviously having 5 sons might place a burden on your heart for fatherhood and specifically manhood and raising boys and things like that. But what's been this journey for you of going, okay, I'm a young guy, gets married, ends up having 5 sons, and now you've got this ministry that we'll talk about that really reaches out to men.
Yeah. It started more when I was in late high school. My parents got divorced, and I was super angry about it. In particular, I was angry at my dad.
Yeah.
And I went to a counselor, and he set me on a trajectory without even really necessarily meaning to.
Did you go to like a school counselor? Or?
It was like through my mom's work. They had like a free counselor.
Were you willing or were you unwilling?
I was in the middle.
Yeah,
I was in the middle.
Okay.
The way I took it was, here's a guy who will let me rant and be angry, right? I mean, I didn't think, he's really going to tell me something amazing, but I was like, at least he'll listen.
He has to listen.
He's paid to listen.
That's
so,
right.
And as we were talking and I was expressing all this frustration, he said a couple things that were really profound. And this has been 35 years ago, and they've just stuck with me. One of them was, he goes, Kent, man, I hear you. You don't want to end up in the same situation. He goes, but you really can't become the unsomething. And I just remember that phrase ringing in my ears, and I had him unpack it a little bit, and he goes, yeah, life has this weird way of turning you into whatever you hate. And so that day, he like almost reached in my head and rewired a few things. And ever since then, it's been different. And the second thing he told me, I said, so what do I do? Like, what do you want me to do? And he goes, well, you don't want to end up where your mom and dad ended up. You're going to need to find good examples of what you do want to be. So instead of saying, well, I won't be, that guy, or I won't be an astronaut, or I won't be, a doctor, what do you want to be?
Right.
And he said, so go get around guys. That's why I have so many cups of coffee, Scott. Like, for real, I love getting around guys who know something I don't, and that's everybody. Mm-hmm. And there's something that I don't know, and I've always been a sponge basically since that day. He set me on this trajectory of just learning from other men. So this whole discipline of kind of pulling mentors into my life and trying to get godly counsel, I wouldn't have told you that I was going to go on that journey at age 18, but that's basically what he did.
So you get married at what age were you?
20. Hold on.
I love it.
Oh, my goodness. 25. So April and I met at 21, and we dated 4 years. Yeah, so okay. 25.
All right. So you get married around 25 years old, and you've got at least in the back of your mind, hey, I don't want to end up like my parents ended up. What were the initial kind of challenges you guys faced in your marriage, and how soon did you have kids and all that kind of thing?
So married at 25, first kid at 30, so we had 5 years of honeymoon, basically, so to speak. No offense to my oldest son. I'm not saying you wrecked the marriage.
It was great till you came.
Sorry, Alex. But the first few years of our marriage were only bumpy. And I know a lot of guys would say this, but I mean, like, genuinely, seriously, the first few years of our marriage were only bumpy due to my irresponsibility and my spiritual immaturity. I became a believer at like 21, right? Yeah. Baptized here at Southland. And so I had a long way to go, man. Yeah. Had a lot of growing up to do spiritually, but also just responsibility-wise. I wouldn't pay bills. It's all kinds of stuff. I was a financial mess. I was a spiritual mess. Yet my wife was in love with me enough to marry me anyhow, and so she had to kind of grow with me through that process.
Yeah.
It was rough.
Yeah, we talk a lot about how the essence of manhood is responsibility, and I'm getting ready to go preach this weekend out of town, and it's so funny. Like, they've had me into this church to speak twice as a guest preacher. The first time they had me come in and preach on lust. It's like, hi, nice to meet you. Let's talk about the deepest, darkest, most shameful area of your life, which is kind of works because, when you're the guest preacher, you can just lob the grenade in the room and walk out, and they email the lead guy who can, you email me in Kentucky, it doesn't matter.
I'm going to take notes on how to be a good guest speaker. Yeah. Just lob grenades, leave it to the lead guy.
Now, you might not get invited back, but that's the interesting thing.
I never have.
I try my best not to be, and that sometimes it works. But so in this time, they want me to speak about dating, but specifically speak to men. And so what I'm going to be talking a little bit about is the essence of manhood is responsibility, but that shows up in some tangible ways through provision and protection. Mm-hmm. So if that's what we're aiming for in marriage, then we need to practice for that in dating. And every man I talk to has to kind of grow into those things. And so you go 5 years. You have a son. Mm-hmm. How did that kind of shift or change things for you?
Yeah, I mean, like, how did it was significant. Yeah. I'm trying to think of a better word, a more funny word, but I didn't know the first thing about being a dad. Mm-hmm. And it's not because my dad was a bad guy. Like, there was the whole marriage drama, but he taught me how to fix stuff. He taught me responsibility. He taught me how to volunteer. He was leader of many, many things in our community. And so I learned a ton of really great, valuable lessons from my dad. The spiritual nurturing of a young man and all that stuff, man, I had to learn on the job. And like most dads, you kind of come in and go, whoa, they let me take this thing home, from the hospital. That's right. And you're thinking, wow, I'm not quite prepared for that. And it was dramatic. The shift was dramatic. But I didn't... one thing about the way God worked in our lives and our marriage in particular was I didn't resent it. Yeah. And what I mean by that is I know some guys, their first baby comes along and they realize, wow, my wife's not quite as accessible. We got this financial burden. He's up all night. And they kind of become like, wow, how do I get myself into this fatherhood thing? And it's like a negative. I never saw it that way. For whatever reason, God just, I've got my other issues, but that wasn't one of them. So we jumped into motherhood and fatherhood with both feet.
Yeah. And then how far apart are your kids?
Let's see, 22, 20, and 18. So we had a baby, then 2 years later a baby, and then 2 years later a baby. So at one point we had 3 under the age of 4 or 5.
Yeah, that's an adventure.
And then we went a break and we started adopting.
You adopted the next
adopted two, yeah.
And how old are they now?
They're currently 11 and 7.
Okay, so at what point in that journey did this burden for manhood, fatherhood, all that kind of really start to? When did you first start feeling it, and then how did that first start expressing itself?
When we started having kids at 30, we started adopting around the age of 40, 42. in that range, about 10 years ago, we started the process for the first time. So when in my early 40s, we started the adoption. And right in my early 40s, around the age of 40, we started experimenting with the idea of, man, should we do something for fathers at our church specifically, at Southeast in Louisville? And we thought, man, what could we do? And so we just started daydreaming with some fellow guys and dads. What would we do? And we started running down a few different paths, and then we took kind of the curriculum path and turned that into some Bible studies. So I would say in my early 40s, it started to become, man, maybe God's calling me to do something in the fatherhood space.
Yeah.
Just the questions started popping up. We didn't have any answers yet, and I probably still have more questions than answers, but that's when it began.
And what did you do to actually, feed your family and keep them, eating and sleeping indoors?
Who says we did, Scott? I mean, you're jumping to a lot of conclusions there. I was in my 20s and 30s in marketing roles. I worked for ad agencies, big companies, little companies. I started my own business a couple times where I did consulting. So I was always either a marketing guy or a sales guy in the corporate world. Mm-hmm. And I did that all the way through my mid-40s.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you got that kind of background. Then now you've got this burden for, and usually burdens are born out of a place where you think there's some kind of a void. Something's not being addressed, or it's not being addressed in the way that it should, or whatever that is. So what was it that, if you kind of looked at the landscape of the church world at that time, that made you go, you know what, this is a space that really needs some intervention?
Yeah, I would say something fairly dramatic that I could back up if we had a couple hours of data to unpack. The single greatest societal problem we have, at least in the Western culture, is the absence of fathers.
Agreed.
I didn't get into it because of that.
Right.
I've discovered that over time.
Along the way.
Everything trends back to fathers being there or being gone. Mm-hmm. A teen pregnancy, gang membership, gun violence, sexual promiscuity, abortion, you name it. All of it trends back to, was there a dad in the home or wasn't there? And so what we're seeing is, if you go back, just real quick data for the nerds in the audience, if you go back to 1960, about 1 out of every 9 or 10 kids was born in a home without a dad. Now it's 1 out of 3.
Right.
Just let it sink in. There's 24 million children right now in America, growing up with no fatherhood presence in the home. And when you just do that times millions of kids, you get
exponential
opioid addiction, you get anxiety, you get mass shootings, you get a lot of things that grow very bad amidst the weeds of no dads. Mm-hmm. That happens.
And so you had the burden for this, and then along the way you've kind of discovered okay, this is bigger than maybe even I initially, thought it might be. But I sense that that hasn't led to a decrease in your passion for this. You don't seem to have this is a mountain too big to climb, so let's just throw in the towel. You seem to be really energized to want to climb this mountain.
What's interesting is, throughout my corporate work, my life at different jobs, like everybody else, you'd get good at a job and then you might get a little more responsibility or get promoted. And so I kept getting bigger jobs in the marketing world to where I finally worked at, a fairly high level from a marketing standpoint. And I'm traveling to Europe all the time, and I had a job that was really challenging and multicultural and a lot of languages, and I had to learn a lot of products I didn't understand. And so there was just a lot of difficulty to that job. It's like when I was a teenager and I would bat against kids in baseball who threw 60 miles an hour or 65, until I bat against this one guy named Steve Dixon one time who threw in the mid-80s at age 16.
Yeah.
And all you wanted to do was not get injured. You just go up and go, I don't mind striking out.
Small of the back,
I just want to go back to the dugout alive. And so when you start hitting faster pitches, and then I realized, wow, God's got me in really deep waters. I can probably take most marketing jobs and, with one arm tied behind my back, do fairly decent.
Yeah.
Because I've just done that 100 times. It's like you preaching on a weekend. Not that you would dial it in or phone it in, but, you don't get intimidated when you've got to prepare a message.
Right.
Where you might have when you were 21. Now I look at this and go, man, the fatherhood problem in our country and in the world is a tsunami. Mm-hmm. And I can't fix it myself at all. But I do know a lot of guys who are out there trying to fix it.
Yeah.
So we're all I was with someone just yesterday in Indianapolis, and we were collaborating together they're working on, one sort of fatherhood hill, and we're working on a different fatherhood hill. Mm-hmm. And the question is, could 1 + 1 = 3? Could we do something together? Because the problem is so massive.
Yeah, we had an event few weeks ago was really, really interesting. Historically, we've done kind of a men's conference, every year or so. We'll do something fun. And we've gotten a lot more strategic about that. Like, what are we actually trying to do and push men towards and that kind of thing. And this year, the idea was, okay, coming out of COVID, one of the things we've noticed is almost all of our kids have come back. In fact, at some of our campuses, we have more kids in our children's ministry than we had before COVID.
Really?
Yeah, it's fascinating.
That's surprising.
It is surprising. And our children's ministry is going, yeah, but the problem is we don't have all of our volunteers back. And so, one of the things that we were trying to push towards was we need men to get in the game. So I stood on stage and kind of used this illustration of it's a sports illustration, which I'm accustomed to, but you're either hurt or you're injured. If you're hurt, you can play. And you may even remember Wayne Smith years ago preached a sermon called Playing Hurt, So, but if you're injured, we need you to heal up. You can't play right now, but we challenged men towards mentorship in our schools, serving in student ministry, serving in kids ministry, that kind of thing. And men really responded in a significant way to that kind of high challenge. But one of the things I said in there too, and you kind of alluded to it, was, I'm going to say it again this weekend, none of us, unfortunately, would be surprised if this week we heard there was a school shooting somewhere. Right. We wouldn't be surprised.
Right.
What would shock us is if that school shooter was a female.
or came from an intact family of everyone who loved her.
Right. And,
right.
and
like, no.
So what I've noticed too is if you say that out loud, and if you, especially the thing about the intact family,
right.
which I've done, there's a certain group of people in our culture who get really animated and mad about you bringing that up. And so I'm sure you've run into this.
Yeah.
Like when you say most of the things that we're trying to battle in the political sphere actually come back to a problem in the home.
Sure.
Man, there's some resistance that people come out. So what have you run into?
It's interesting. If I could take a small diversion, I was reading recently in prepping for a talk I'm giving in November. I was studying up a lot on the life of Josiah, and when you look at what Josiah did, grandfather was, offering children to the, the Molech, and then dad did the same thing. Dad gets assassinated, but you get this guy Josiah who says, "Man, we got to do this differently." If you look at how Josiah did it, he started in the temple.
Yeah.
Like one of the first places, he was like, we got to get all these idols out of the temple.
Yeah.
The second thing he did was, we got to get these idols out of the king's palace. We got them on our roof. And so you look at these concentric circles of how Josiah kind of went about it. We got to get him out of Judah. We got to get him out of Samaria. And he started moving outward. And I think there's a metaphor in that, right? Where a lot of men and a lot of dads in particular believe that the problem is out there.
Right. We want to start. We want to stay way out here.
It's Washington D.C. Yeah. It's Scott's preaching. It's whatever.
Right.
And they believe the problem is out there, when usually the problem is in our own heart. I mean, and that's not brand new. Goodness, it's ecclesiastical. But we get distracted because we have so much noise about the problems out there. Because the problems out there are out there. However, how am I doing in my own walk? Right? Before I worry deeply about whether every decision in Washington, D.C. or Frankfort, Kentucky is made the way I would make those decisions, the question is, are the decisions made at my home address the decisions that should be being made? And so for me, I've never really had a problem with that. Now, a lot of people do, to your point. A lot of people want to believe the problem is outside themselves. But again, we're back to the Garden of Eden, right? It's Adam going, the woman you gave me, you know what she did? And God's going, man, seriously? And so for me, we have bumped into that for sure, because fatherhood is not something you can repair overnight. And the challenge is, I once did a radio program, Scott, and the next week I was contacted by about 10 people who wanted more information. 7 of them were single moms.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's interesting, because of Dad's absence, we've laid a lot of this work on single moms.
That's right.
And we've laid a ton of it on like youth pastors.
That's right.
Right? Youth pastors.
We've outsourced it.
Yeah, and they got to deal with all these kids who ought to be walking in thinking about, how do I go on mission for Jesus?
Right.
But they're walking in without a clue about how to live. And they're walking in with anger and anxiety because they go back home to a place that doesn't feel safe or doesn't feel nurturing. And we feel like that's just the front lines God wants us to be, out there working on.
Yeah, the church, and having been a former youth pastor, children's pastor, all that kind of thing, it's a tricky place to go. we're supposed to be a supplement to what you're doing at home in an ideal world. We're not in an ideal world. We're definitely not in that. But one of the sad things is when you do have those intact families who still view it that way. So where you're going, hey,
how do you mean view it?
So if you've got a mom and a dad, they've got a basket full of kids, but they see that as the church's responsibility to train their children, especially when it comes to spiritually, as opposed to being a supplement to what they're doing at home. So back to, the ultimate sin of men is passivity. We'll sit back and we'll abdicate our responsibility, which is what Adam did. And so we'll see that show up in the church where men who are equipped and could lead in their home and serve in their home in a substantial way spiritually with their children, with their wife, just don't. And they think that just because they bring them to church on Sunday or send them on Wednesday night, that ought to do the trick, or especially if they send them to a Christian school as well.
I had a really weird opportunity, weird in a good way, unique, I should say. I was with a guy in London, England one time, and he's like a super famous Christian guy in the European part of the world. And he said, hey, Kent, what do you hope Manhood Journey does? And I drew on a napkin a radio knob. And I think guys listening, even on audio, can totally picture this.
Yeah.
A radio knob turned all the way down.
Yeah.
And at 0, I'm outsourcing the discipleship of my children.
Right.
I might be knocking it out at work. I might be pulling down big money. No telling. I'll be working on the car every weekend, cutting the grass. I'm involved, but I've said on the discipleship knob, I'm going to turn it all the way down, and I just outsource it. It's Scott's problem. It's the church's problem. Why do I send him to that fancy Christian school? Turned all the way up. For Spinal Tap fans to 11, turned all the way up. It is I'm going to disciple my children.
Yeah.
And I hope there's a dad out there listening, a man out there listening right now, and he can see the knob in his head, and he can see that he's at like 3 or 5 or 7, and he wants to turn it up a notch. Because for me, I'm not going to be responsible. Now I've got adult children, starting to leave the nest. I'm not responsible for every decision they make in their 20s.
Yeah.
I'm not. But I am responsible for giving them every opportunity to choose Christ before they leave my house.
Yeah.
They may choose, they may not. Yeah. Free will is this really thorny problem. It exists. The struggle is real. But what God's going to ask me, man, is, hey, did you give your kids every shot to know Jesus?
So I've heard you talk about that before. And so talk about, because there's men listening right now, that what I've seen is that a lot of times really good fathers will often feel like they're underperforming. They'll think, man, I just suck at this. Like I'm the worst dad of all the dads that have ever been a dad. Oftentimes, and on certain days, we all feel that way. You've been there, I've been there. So here's a dad who's going, man, if I'm looking at those dials, maybe I'm like at a 3 or a 4 or whatever. Right. What would you say first to encourage him, and then secondly, what would you say to challenge him, to help him turn that dial up?
I don't know if this will encourage him, but the last time I felt that way was this morning. And that is not.
That's exactly right.
And Scott, I don't mean that like as a joke.
Hypothetically, yeah.
This morning, I was getting my 3 boys in the car so they could go to school, and I was so rough and aggressive with my 7-year-old boy, like, get in the car. He literally started crying.
Yep.
So you might want to just turn this podcast off now because you're listening to one huge failure being interviewed by Scott Nickel. So those moments are going to happen. Like that's the reality. The thing that I would say to encourage dads is our enemy, Satan, wants the image of father. And the reason he wants the image of father is because 160 times in the New Testament, Jesus said, my father, my father, my father, my father. God wants to be known as a father. So Satan has always wanted God's image. So Satan wants to be the father. So what he gets us to do is put ourselves on the sidelines.
Right.
That's what he wants us, because no one's going to fire you from the fatherhood game. It's not a coach pulling you out of the game. You walk off the field because you feel like a failure. Because Satan convinces you that when you fail, you should probably just take a seat on the bench. Dads, come on, man. We know his schemes. We know what's going on. Don't fall for that. You're going to fail over and over again. But you know who's thrown a lot of interceptions, man? Tom Brady. Joe Montana. They threw a lot of interceptions. Also a lot of touchdowns. Right. So don't let every failure cause you to want to self-disqualify yourselves. And secondly, the thing I would say to challenge them is, go look at the story of the American sniper, Chris Kyle. Who, we know he killed 250 people for sure, which means he probably killed 400 or 500.
Right.
Here's a guy who can, the devil of Ramadi, the most feared American soldier in the last 75 years internationally, bounties on his head. He'd been everywhere dangerous. and lived and took bad guys out until he takes a crazy guy to a gun range in Texas.
Right.
The crazy guy kills Chris Kyle, the best warrior we've seen in American, military in a long time. If someone had elbowed Chris Kyle that morning and said, "Hey, man, by the way, this guy is going to try to shoot you," who leaves that truck alive?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's just not
Chris
even.
Kyle.
It's not even a question. He didn't know he was in a battle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He did not know he was in a battle. And Dad, here's the deal. If you have children, if you're married, guess what? Your marriage is a picture of the gospel. If you have children, you're a picture of God the Father, whether you like it or not. You're in the battle.
Yeah.
You're in the battle. So the encouraging part is, let's go. We're all in the same battle. Mm-hmm. Don't be surprised. It's a battle. And that's why fatherhood is hard.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's a book called The Boy Crisis. And, it's full of stats. It's full of stats. In fact, I've told people, I'm like, this book is really great at diagnosis, not so great in prescription. The end of it is a little bit abrupt and half-hearted, if you ask me. But it is really helpful and illuminating, I think, in regards to just the dire circumstances. One of the things that I did find fascinating was they talk about how just the mere presence of a father in the home impacts all those stats and more that you rattled off at the beginning of the podcast, which is really fascinating because it just means just you being there with a pulse helps.
Yeah. Well, and
statistically.
Even that story was it's about 6 months old now, but there was a school, I think it was in Louisiana. I don't remember which city, but they had all these fights and gang trouble at the school. Yes. And some dads just said, "Hey, well, you know what we're going to do? We're all going to take shifts and show up." Mm-hmm. They didn't have weapons. They didn't have training. Right. They weren't like intervention.
Just be there.
Physically on campus. And within like a week, 90-something% of the incidents went away.
Right.
And I just find that so biblical and so fascinating.
And so illuminating to anyone who thinks there's no differences between men and women.
Oh, my word.
It's that is right there of an experiment that reveals something we already know to be true, you know.
Right.
And I found that to be true in children's ministry and student ministry. Women bring a lot of gifts and things to the table that men don't bring. And one of the things that men bring to the table that women don't bring is when they enter a room, the room changes in a way, especially with young boys.
Oh, man.
They just ratchet it down a little bit, which is a good thing,
It is a good thing.
So you've alluded to this a couple times. So you have a ministry called Manhood Journey. How long you been doing that?
We started on a whiteboard at Southeast Christian in 2010 with ideas, and then we were incorporated around 2013, and I've been full-time since 2016. So our roots date about 12 years back, and our actual kind of public activity dates about 7-8 years back.
Yeah. And so what do you guys do?
We create resources to help dads become disciple makers. Like that is our objective. And the way we do it is through a lot of stuff. It's ebooks and Bible studies and digital courses. So we're trying to arm dads, tons of free stuff, some events, you name it. And we want to help dads be comfortable discipling their children. In particular, the first thing we ever created were Bible studies to be done with fathers and sons at the same time. Because a lot of dads just feel ill-equipped.
Yeah.
And you know why? Because we are. I mean, the reason we feel like failures is because we fail. It's okay. The reason we feel ill-equipped is because many of us are ill-equipped. I don't want to become my kid's hero. That's not my objective. My objective is to have Jesus be their hero, and I'm just their guide to get them there. And so what we're trying to build is a bunch of resources to help dads learn how to do that guiding process. You're not the Alpha and Omega, but you do know who it is. So let's introduce our kids to the Alpha and the Omega.
Right. And so in the course of that kind of journey of creating Manhood Journey and creating those resources and things like that, what's been the feedback from men that's helped shape what you do?
That's a good question. Because I'm a bit of a marketing nerd, like those were all my previous jobs, we've done a lot of surveying and a lot of qualitative analysis, not so much quant, but qualitative analysis of feedback we've gotten. And what I've heard from dads is primarily 2 or 3 big dominant themes. One dominant theme is time management. I don't have enough time. I ain't got enough time to do everything. I run out of time every day, wearing all the hats. And so there's this kind of like pie chart in their head, and they're not sure they're allocating the right amount of time to each slice.
Right.
Marriage slice, work slice, cut the yard, So that's a big, big challenge for dads. Big challenge number 1, they all believe is time. Second is communication. I don't know how to get my teenager to talk to me. I ask them how their day was. They say fine, and then we go on. Which, by the way, Dad, quick commercial. If that's the question you ask your children, you deserve a lame response because that's a lame question. So
and it's the one you
better
gave.
Questions.
It's the one you gave when you were a teenager.
Better questions, Dad.
Right.
So we hear time, we hear communication, but I would say there's a big overarching feeling to everything that I see, and that's the word failure.
Yeah,
and it's that dads feel like they're failing.
Yeah.
And what I would ask any dad who feels that way is compared to what? So, for example, if you take me to a basketball court right now and you throw me out there and I start shooting hoops, you don't know if I'm good or bad until Oscar Shibwe shows up. And then you realize, oh my gosh, Kent's horrible compared to him. Right. Now, if Oscar were out there and LeBron shows up, it'd be a little more of a game, right? So compared to what?
Yeah.
And I think what a lot of dads are comparing themselves to is some idealistic version of them, the perfect version of them, Jesus himself, Billy Graham, their own father, whatever it is. Dads are using some bar and they're going, man, I'm just really far short of that bar. And what I would argue, Scott, is that's the wrong bar.
Yeah.
It's the wrong bar, man. I'm 5'4", right? And so here's what I know God's not going to ask me when I get to heaven. How come you didn't do the high jump in the Olympics? I know he's not going to ask me that.
You never made it to the NBA, bro? Come on.
And so I want dads to embrace the Ephesians 2:10, good works God has given them to do.
Yeah.
Them to do. You don't got to be your own dad. You don't got to be the opposite of your own dad. You don't got to be Billy Graham. You don't got to be Wayne Smith or Scott Nickel or John Weiss. You got to be the dad God's called you to be. And the challenge with that is it requires more faith, more discipline, and more Bible study than most of us are willing to invest.
Yeah. And that's why we'll tap out of the fatherhood thing where we feel like a failure and we'll invest more of our time and skill and energy into the other places where we know we can win. Yeah, right. So that's why it shows up at the office. That's why dudes play softball all the time. That's why they play golf all the time. Because if I can't win at home, I need to find somewhere to win because I can't live under the burden of feeling like a failure all day, every day. Right.
We desperately want a scoreboard to keep track, even though the big wins as a dad, you can hardly track.
Yeah.
So
they're hard to measure.
Bro,
that's right.
Bro, so I had one moment, you just reminded me of a story when my boys were younger, and one of them was 8 or 9 or so, and he dove off of a stool onto a beanbag in our basement, but he missed the beanbag and went straight into the concrete, right?
Right.
So he gets knocked out completely. My wife is panicked. She's calling 911. The EMS finally comes, and he had just knocked himself out. No big deal. Later that night, I come home.
Spoken like a true dad. He just knocked himself out. No big deal. Hit the beanbag next time, son. That's right.
Details. So later that night, my wife is telling me the story, and my oldest son is in the room. He wasn't the one who dove, and my wife looks at him and goes, "Alex, when the EMS got here, you were up. Where'd you go?" Because it was the younger, and Alex said, "Well, I went upstairs," and she said, "Why?" And he said, "To pray for my little brother."
Wow. Yeah.
And that's a moment, right?
Yes.
When you go, and that's a 98-yard kickoff return.
That's right.
Right? That's a whole that but we skip over that. How'd you do on your ACT?
Yeah.
Or how'd you do, making that money at that grass cutting job?
That's right.
Whoa, time out. Those spiritual victories.
Yeah.
When we do see them, man, we got to notice them.
And celebrate them,
Yeah.
And it's so easy as a dad to really remember the bad moment this morning at the car and,
Absolutely.
and feel burdened and weighed down by that and then miss some of those. When you and I had coffee, a while back, I shared with you a dad win story, and one of the
story.
Yeah, one of the things that made me want to invite you on this podcast was, I got emotional telling you that story and was like, "Hey man, I'm going to try not to cry." And you're like, "Cry." All right, this dude's the real thing, Are
you going to tell a story now?
No, I don't think
Can you tell a version of it?
Well, it was one of those.
There was a guy.
Yeah, it was just one of those dad moments where you realize that the investment you've put in has led to when your son needs you, he comes your direction.
There we go.
And in the midst of pain and conflict and things like that, and so. Those are those moments where, and we were joking in a meeting not too long ago. I forget who said this. Somebody shared a dad win, like a parent win, something like that. And those are the moments where you go, "Oh man, it took." It's like all the stuff I've been trying to build in, all the things I've been trying to. Maybe it took a little bit because there are those moments along the way. If you're measuring every day, every moment, it's like going up to the, we have one in our house, probably you do too, where you measure your kids on the wall. If you do that every day, you're not going to see it, right?
Yeah,
But if you wait a little while, you'll see, oh man, you grew an inch in the past couple months or whatever. And so if you'll just kind of pay attention over a season and over time and not get so deeply invested in those little moments along the way, you'll see that your kids are really growing. Sometimes it takes other eyes to see it too, is what I've noticed. Like I've had some people, say, hey man, really noticing this about Silas, my 13-year-old son, and it's like, man, that's really good to hear, because other people go a little while without seeing or hearing from your kids. You're with them in the trenches every day.
That's a good word. You can usually see how other people's kids are progressing, sometimes better than they can.
Yeah, and it's like I just saw some of the baseball players that my older son plays with that I haven't seen in a few months. And I was like, good gracious, they're all huge. They're high school boys that have all grown in a few months and putting on some weight and muscle and blah, blah, blah. But, during the baseball season, I would never go, hey, man, look at Aubrey. He's really grown. But, if you give me a few months away from him, I can see it, So I would tell dads like, hey, I've been really fortunate. I've got a lot of really good men in my life who also care about my kids. And so it's kind of easy for me to go, hey, what are you seeing in Eli? What are you seeing in Bo? What that kind of thing. What about Landry? But if you don't have that, try to recruit some men around you.
I was going to ask you, do you have those men around because you did some of that recruiting?
Yeah, informally. So, as a dad, one of the things, especially with my oldest son, because of how he's wired, somehow intuitively I knew, God's entrusted me with him. He's the most competitive person I've ever met in my life. Wow. He's intense. He's a hard charger. Yeah. I'm going to need some other really strong men who love Jesus that he'll respect to be around him. So from the time he was about 4, I knew I was going to need some men like that in his life. And so that's been one of the cool things is watching, like, my closest friend outside of my wife is a dude named Vinny. And I remember bringing Vinny to a wrestling meet that Eli had when he was 4.
No kidding.
Somebody told me when Eli was 4 that they had wrestling teams that 4-year-olds could be on, and I was like, sign me up, because he was
energy.
He was so energetic.
Absolutely.
I was like, where can I bring him? I didn't care a thing about the meets. I was like, just make him tired every day. So he goes to this first meet, and he had been so successful in practice that he thought he was just going to walk all over people, and he gets thrashed by this kid. And he throws an absolute
Who was 3.5.
Yeah, exactly. and so Eli just throws this absolute fit,
Really?
And Vinny was there. He saw the whole thing. We went to lunch afterwards. But fast forward, Eli is 16 years old now, and there are times when he calls Vinny.
Wow.
And it's like, and I fully trust him. Like I know, man, please call Vinny. Please. Right. I'm glad you're texting Vinny. I'm glad you called him when that struggle hit or whatever that was. Because you know how it is as a dad. Like, I can say something over and over again, but somebody else says it that they respect or see in a different light, and all of a sudden and I'm happy with that. So I've tried to over the years. I go on down the list, guys named Ross, named Rod. There's a few people that I go, man, they've been awesome in the life, especially for my sons. And so I would just tell men, like, look for guys who will, you're not needing them to be, a substitute dad. You just need them to be a friend, an adopted uncle, or whatever that is, to help you, because they're going to encourage you in ways. And that's been one of the helpful things too, is to go, okay, you're telling me he won't end up in prison? Okay, all right,
or at least have a shot,
right? Like, you'll help bail him out at least.
I have a friend in Nashville. My son moved to Nashville, my oldest, and he and his wife. And I have a friend down there, Michael, and I were texting recently, and I said, hey, by the way, my son moved to Nashville. And he goes, give him my number right now. He needs to know he has a stepdad in Nashville. Right. And I was like, man, this is so great.
It's worth its weight in gold, man.
It's so great.
It's worth its weight in gold, and when you see your kids, struggle, sometimes you just need an outlet, like to be able to pull somebody aside and go, hey, I'm watching my daughter struggle through this. Can I just bounce this off of you? Those relationships are just tremendous. And then especially when you see that your kids build relationships with other people that you trust, man, it's huge.
That's probably one of the things I look back at that moment when I was in my late teens, that the counselor's name was Weldon. And when Weldon said, you need to find other men who have what you don't and get around them, man, I'm surrounded. I am literally surrounded by guys because of 35 years of of having cultivated that kind of attitude because of the seed Weldon planted with me. And I hope there's a dad listening where we can say, hey, man, if you're all alone, I'm sorry you're all alone. Don't be much longer. Let's go find some guys to get around you.
I think that's huge. And I think there are a lot of men who are. I talk to a lot of men who go, man, I don't have anybody. Yeah. You know, so when I've had a couple different sermons that talk about who are the men at your table. So who has a seat at your table where you're inviting them to the table to speak into your life and to say things that you may not like, you know, that they have that level of trust with you that they can sit down and say, hey, man, here's where you're off. And most men I talk to go, I got buddies, but I don't have men like that. You know, I don't have men that I've invited to speak into the most important areas of my life, or that really even have a window into that. I just play golf with them, or I just coach baseball with them, or whatever that is. And so that's one of the reasons I think that being intentional about getting into groups and then not playing games. Let's not play games. Like, we don't have time to sit around and just play Sunday. Let's all give a Sunday school answer, you know, and go on about our day. If you're going to get in a group of men, talk about real things in real ways with real people. Don't waste each other's time, you know.
I remember reading Proverbs chapter 1 one time, Scott, and the first few verses are like, you know, for wisdom, and here's why Solomon wrote it. Then it goes on, and wisdom is personified, and she starts talking like this woman, and she says, hey, man, you know, I tried to get your attention. Yeah. And the picture that came to mind when I read that 5-10 years ago was the picture of Times Square, New York. Yeah. I see it like that because she's going, hey, I was at the street corner. I was waving. I was trying to get your attention, but you wouldn't listen. Yeah. And then you go like 10, 12 verses in Proverbs 1 of her going, so tell you what, I'm going to let you have it. You're going to have all your decisions. You can have them. And one guy said one time, God will never leave you or forsake you, but wisdom will kick you to the curb. And, you know, so the moral of the story was at the very end of Proverbs chapter 1, she says, however, when you return back, I'll be there. Like there's this one little verse with a little bit of hope for men, you know, if we believe we're going to make it through this life, serving Christ well, loving our wives well, leading our families well, all by ourselves, and it's just so it's almost too easy. It's like a paper doll. Just push it over. That's so unbiblical. It's so unbiblical, man. We need other men in our life around us, and you know, you might be starting from scratch. You might be listening to this, going, "All right, I'll buy it," and you're starting from scratch. And I would tell you one of the best ways to find other men around in your life is, you know, a coffee shop. Just, you know, find some dude who knows something you don't. And ask him to go grab a cup of coffee.
That's right.
And just start that relationship.
Look for somebody that you go, man, he seems like he might know something about being a dad. He seems like he might know something about being a husband. Can we go talk sometime? Yeah. And you'd be surprised how many people will take you up on that, you know, and they'll go, yeah, man, I'm happy to do that, you know. And a lot of times if you go, hey, just download all your wisdom, they might stare at you blankly and go, what are you talking about? But if you'll ask good questions, or if you'll just get them to tell their story a little bit, you'll pick up on all kinds of things.
I remember years ago reading the book Shepherding a Child's Heart by Ted Tripp. It's a bit dated now, but the principle of the book was, I'm after my child's heart, not my child's behavior. Right. So if we summarize, and he talked in the book about this term called rich entreaty. And what he meant by that was good questions. And we go back to that thing we were talking about earlier. If you ask your 14-year-old daughter or 16-year-old son, how was your day? They're going to say, fine. And that's the end. And then you go, kids today. No, that's a lousy question, right? So come on. So I remember in the book, he was just talking about, do you entreat your children? Like, are you reaching in? And the verse that I think he was using was Proverbs 20, verse 5, and it says, the purposes of a man's heart are like deep waters, but a man of understanding draws them out. Right. And if you think of that picture, how'd they get water in the first century or 500 BC? Well, man, there's a well, and you need a bucket, and you need a rope. You got, you know, it's not usually right next door. You're going to walk through the woods. And so for us to pull out of our children's hearts what they care about, what they're afraid of, what they want, it's going to be work. Yeah. It's meant to be work. But a man of understanding will draw it out.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting, because I can fully sympathize with my kids in that moment, because when I walk in the door and I'm tired and my wife goes, how was your day? You know what I want to say? Fine. Fine is fine. You know, because in that moment, I'm not prepared to sit down and have a conversation. You know, I'm an introverted person.
Are you really?
I am. Most people think that people who stand on stage are extroverts. It's usually the opposite, So it takes me a while, man. Like I've got to wind down, and then I've got to be in a frame of mind to have a conversation. Allie will laugh, and she'll go, "Have you used all your words today?" And I go, "Yeah, I've used all my words today. I'll try my best to give you some words here in a little bit, And so she's learned over time how and when to ask me good questions so that she can draw out of me what I'm actually feeling. She can usually get what I'm thinking. That's easy for me. What I'm feeling is different. And so I think the same is true with our kids. Like if we hit them as soon as they come through the door,
right?
With tell me everything about your day and overwhelm them, or how was your day? They may not be prepared for that. But one thing I've noticed is, you've probably seen this before too, especially when they're little. At bedtime, things happen. Like as you're tugging them in, you're reading them stories, things like that. For whatever reason, in the safety and security of that moment, a lot of times they'll kind of open up and start telling you about what's going on in their life.
Yeah.
Sometimes boys especially, they just need to do what I would prefer to do, which is like, let's talk while we shoot basketball, or let's talk while we're throwing a baseball, or let's talk shoulder to shoulder while we're driving in the truck, And I've seen boys open up better when they're doing something, as opposed to, if you'll sit down now, we're going to have a conversation about our feelings.
Look in my eyes.
Yeah, if you want to make a boy squirm, just say that to him, So to your point, I think that's just spot on. Like, there's some work involved in this. Let's think this through. Like, how would you want to be engaged if someone is really trying to find out about what's going on in your heart and your mind and your day and all that kind of thing?
Well, and I look at it like, there's a handful, just for fun, if you guys want to take notes, if you're not like running on the treadmill or out mowing the grass, here's 2 or 3 things you can say to your teenage child that will be at least a 50-50 shot of opening them up. You can ask them, like, what surprised you today?
Yeah.
Right? There's just something about the word surprise that fires a synapse in your brain that doesn't fire if you don't. You can learn a phrase, a 3-word phrase that is not even a question, that opens people's hearts. And the phrase is, tell me more. Scott, tell me about when you were a pastor in Colorado. And then you tell me in 1 minute answer, and I go, tell me more. And then you tell me some more. And then you give me another minute, and I go, tell me more. And you just keep talking.
Right.
And it's a bit like a hostage negotiation. What I'm trying to do is just keep you talking, you talking. I remember I had a really fortunate moment in my career where I worked for a sales guy who was not only a great sales guy, he was a really high moral, high integrity guy, and he was an amazing teacher. So he knew his job, but he could also teach his job really well. And that's when I got baptized in questions.
Yeah.
And you could watch him in a business setting, just go, Scott, what problems are you having these days? We're not even talking about the products. He brought a sample bag, but it's not, wait a minute. And if we could adopt that posture, where what I'm trying to get out of my child and even my wife's mind is enough clay to work with.
Yeah.
Right? I want to fashion something with my own 2 little hands, but you're the one who's going to provide me with the clay.
Material.
And I'm just going to pull it out of you. Hey, man, how's your day been? Yeah? What went wrong today?
Yeah.
What went right today? What was the best part? What was the worst part? Anything surprise you?
Yeah.
And before you know it, I'm holding 4 or 5 data points, and then I can pick one.
Yeah.
You said that thing surprised you. Why did it surprise you?
Yeah.
And we're off to the races, and I can get them talking, and they'll open up.
And then all that information carries over. So now you have something the next time around to go, well, tell me more about that thing with that girl, how's that going for you, that kind of thing. And all of a sudden, this starts to become kind of normal.
Yeah.
And they're kind of accustomed to it,
It is funny. We'll have people visit, and April or I will go into Q&A mode, and it will notice, this is not normal for them.
Yeah, that's right. They're like, why is this dude?
Jeez, man, what's with the 3rd degree? But in our own home, it's extremely normal.
Yeah.
That's just kind of the way we've driven it. And it's a lot of books, it's a lot of Bible, it's a lot of training for me at my job. So it's this weird concoction of I can probably have a 30-minute engagement with somebody and never make a statement.
Yeah.
Just ask questions.
Yeah.
Really? Why'd you say that, Scott? Is that true? How'd you find that to be true? Where'd you learn that?
Yeah.
What made you think that? Did you think something else was going to happen? And it's just one question after the other. And before you know it, man, I know a lot about where your mind and heart are. And I don't want to be coy and never disclose myself. At the same time, that's one of the things I enjoy more. If I can be in a teaching environment, because I'm in a bunch throughout the year, I'd much rather be in a teaching environment with 20 to 50 people than 1 to 500. Because in those environments, I got to kind of preach and speak.
Right.
In the environments with a few dozen or 100 or less, I can use audience Q&A. Right. And I would much rather be in that smaller environment where I can just say, what's on your mind?
Yeah.
What's the problem you're having right now? And for me, that's a more fun environment. I know some dads that's intimidating, or they might be introverts. But the cool thing about being an introvert, and let me test something with you since you claim to be an introvert. People say, well, I'm not as much of a communicator because I'm an introvert. But what I find amazing about guys who tend to be more introverted is guys like you tend to be better listeners. So I think introverts have a communicative advantage because you're used to being willing to listen and process, where I'm used to just talking. You and I might be the opposite. And people think, oh, Ken Evans, what a communicator. No, what a talker. Right? What a talker. Because communication, by definition, is a two-way street. And if you're an introvert, bro, you probably have a head start on a lot of us extroverts because you're pre-wired to listen. Is that true or false? Does that resonate, or what do you think?
No, it resonates a ton. I think there's the quintessential example of this to me is John Weiss. So John is very introverted, and he's slow to speak, and he's quiet, and man, when he speaks, so he's doing a lot of listening. He's a very good listener. He's doing a lot of processing, and so then when he says something, you're like, good golly, man, that dude is wise, but he is very, very introverted, and so it often surprises people when we tell them that we're introverts. But I tend to watch and spectate, and I'm really intuitive in regards to how people say things and what they're saying, and I have a pretty decent memory. And I also was an only.
I'm sorry, what were you saying?
Yeah, I also was an only child, so I'm just sitting around by myself all the time in my head, for most of my life. So, I may have told you this, over coffee, the minute we had one kid, I was like, good Lord, this house is crowded, there's 3 people in here right now. That's hilarious. But that's been one of the joys of my life, is having this full home. It's been just such God's redemptive work in my life, just being able to be a part of a full home. My daughter was home last night from college just to hang out for a few minutes. Home from college that's 4 miles down the road, and but just having her in the house again, and all and then one came in from football practice and the other came in from something, and it was just really cool. But for me, that wasn't normal, just to have all this noise. I just lived inside my head for enormous amounts of my life, and so when I'll speak, it's usually based on a whole bunch of things I've already processed. I've already, I'm not an external processor. I'm an internal processor first. And then when it comes out, it's something that I've thought through quite a bit.
I remember in my early 40s, I had a job, and I had to travel a lot for this particular job internationally. And so I was flying over the Atlantic over and over again and going to countries where their native language wasn't English. And I had no relationships. And I just remember going probably a year or two, being in a lot of places where I couldn't engage with my environment around me the way I wanted to.
Yeah.
And you know what people ask me, what did God teach you in that job? He taught me how to be alone and not implode, because I wanted to implode. That absence of connection. I don't cry very often.
Yeah.
And I remember being in a hotel room in Grenoble, France, literally crying. Literally crying at 40-something, going, why am I here?
Yeah.
There's no one to talk to. There's no one to engage with. And then, no joke, I walked to the office the next morning, and between my hotel and the office, there was a McDonald's in the middle of France, and I was like, heck yes! And so that night after work, I went to McDonald's and got a Big Mac, because it just...
Yeah, it's home.
It connected me, and I don't like being alone. I don't mind it now. I really hated it then.
Well, and that's funny, because I've moved the other direction, whereas you can put me by myself anywhere, I'm fine, But as I've gotten older and been accustomed to a full home and things like that, I've found myself, traveling, that kind of thing, where this sucks, man. I hate this. I want to be home with my kids. I want to be on the couch with my wife. I'm going to Baltimore this weekend. I'm not looking forward to it's less than 24 hours.
Right. One night.
It's just one night,
Right.
But so I've seen that move that direction for me. You're just moving the opposite direction.
Well, I think it's like anything else. I have a love-hate relationship with the Enneagram, right? I'm not, you might be the Enneagram guy for all I know, but
I'm not.
And the love is, I think we all need more awareness. It's really
if
handy.
Something helps you figure that out.
Absolutely. The hate part of it is we lock ourselves in, right? So I'm a 4, I'm a 7, I'm an 8, and so therefore I don't ever got to listen. or
right.
I don't, since,
right.
since I don't like confrontation, I don't ever have to bring up anything uncomfortable because my Enneagram told me I don't have to. And so I think sometimes we can use it as a crutch, but from my perspective, if you could do the personality type of Jesus, he'd be right in the middle of all of them, right?
Sure.
I remember hearing a guy one time, Scott, did an example in a room, and he said, all you guys who tend to operate out of truth, go to one side of the room. Yeah. You're the truth tellers. All you guys who operate out of grace, go to the other side of the room. And if you're somewhere in the middle, stand in the middle. So then he had this whole explanation of truth and grace. And then he asked the question, where would Jesus be standing? And everybody, had their arguments, right? Truth, he's truth, grace all the time. He's truth and grace, And he said, where Jesus was standing in the room? Wherever the person across from him needed him to stand in the moment.
That's right.
Oh, it was fascinating.
That's really good.
He goes, let me take you through the life of Peter. And the guy literally walked across the room. The room and go, hey, this scripture was when he was giving Peter grace. This one was when he was giving him truth.
That's right.
And what did he need in the moment? What did he need in the moment? And for us, I think that's why, as a dad, how many kids you got? Remind me.
4.
4, yeah, 4. I've got 5. And so they all have different personalities. They're all wired a little different. Some are more like me. Some are less like me. But over time, one of the ways I want to grow as a father is being able to relate to my children wherever they are on the Enneagram, wherever they are in the room.
Yeah.
And so I probably have needed to pick up some introversion type skills and some willingness to be quiet and be alone so I could relate to my boys who are a bit more quiet. And one day, hopefully, I've got 5 daughters-in-law. I've already got one. She's amazing. So one day I hope I got 10 kids, right? And I want to be able to relate to all of them.
Yeah.
And so for me to lock in and go, well, I'm just an extrovert. You're going to have to listen to me for an hour and a half, or I'm just an introvert. I ain't going to say anything. Man, I don't know. You can die on that hill, but I think he who relates to the most people wins, right?
I agree. And, it's interesting to say that because that's grace. This is truth. And, people who know me really well are aware of that, and that has been something that's guided me in preaching, but it's also something that guides me in parenting.
Oh, wow.
And John Weiss says, you need to parent to the personality. And I think that's really key is like pay attention to that child's personality and shepherd them and lead them based on where they are.
My 2 oldest kids, Scott, my oldest is super hard-headed, very driven, and he would literally do something, know he was going to get a spanking, do it anyway, take the spanking, no problem, right? And you'd tell him no, and he'd be like, and he'd buck up, and you're going to have a fight. My second child, when you would tell him no, he'd just start crying.
Yep.
And then it was one of my first moments realizing, I don't have these skills. I don't have these skills.
Well, to your point about what do they need in this moment. So Allie and I, my wife and I, we've had these conversations like, I think that one needs some grace right now. Like they just really need some grace. And that one over there needs some truth. You need to speak some truth into that child's life, And I'm truth oriented. So I lean towards truth. Like just don't be dumb. I joke with
Stop it.
I joke with especially my boys. I go, I have two rules for life. Like Jordan Peterson writes books with 12 and 15. I have 2. Number 1, they've heard this on the podcast before. Number 1 is don't be dumb.
Don't be dumb.
And really 2 is just a subset of 1, which is don't have sex with someone you're not married to, And if you
which
follow,
by the way is dumb.
Yeah, it's dumb. So that's why I mean it's a subset.
Like I said,
it's dumb. So if you'll follow those rules, life gets simple. Like it gets really, really simple. But that's my truth. Oriented side that just don't be dumb and life gets easy. Well, I do a bunch of dumb things all the time, and so do you. So sometimes my kid doesn't need to be told quit being dumb.
Right.
My kid needs some grace because I've been dumb plenty of times in my life. So pay attention to what their needs are in that moment. And I think that's really well put. Like Jesus positioned himself as someone. John 1:14 tells us he was full of grace and truth. Right. He was full of both. He wasn't 50-50.
Right.
He was 100-100.
Right.
And he gave out of whatever was the need with the person. That's a really good way to put it.
He didn't live out of his personality.
Right.
He lived out of his identity.
Yeah.
But he met people where they were. The adulterous woman needed grace in that moment.
That's right.
The Pharisees generally needed to be grabbed by the shirt collar. And so that's how he related to them because it was all redemptive. It was never punitive.
Yeah.
It was never punitive. He wasn't trying to grab the Pharisees by the shirt collar so that they would feel bad.
Yeah.
He was hoping he'd get a Nicodemus out of that crowd or get a Joseph of Arimathea out of that crowd. So he was hoping for the redemptive side of that story. And so for me as a dad, question is, am I operating like that?
Yeah. Well, and it's to your point, it's so easy to go, well, that's just who I am. Okay. But you're not gonna captivate your child's heart, and would you you could apply that to so many other circumstances and go, well, okay, but you're not going to get the best out of that person. You know,
I heard somebody recently that I need to go back and figure out who it was because I want to give them credit, but I'm not going to give them credit on this podcast because I can't remember their name. But they said, if you only do what you've always done, you'll only be what you already are. And if God's not the God of redemption and growth and change and, you know, then what is going on here? And so for me as a dad, one of the challenging things is it's literally on-the-job training, right? It's like you start at a place of abject failure, and then you continue to go through less failure, and then you get to like, okay, occasional failure, but you're going to be continually experimenting, and there are pieces of the fatherhood puzzle I handle really well, and there's a lot of pieces I don't handle very well at all.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I'm not an okay dad. Doesn't mean I'm a total failure. But what it means is I need to grow, and I'm going to need to lean in. Well, heck, coming into the ministry world, right? Raising money, speaking, doing more writing. There's a lot of things I'm doing now that I was not a very good expert at 6, 8, 10 years ago. And I'm not sure I'm an expert now, but I'm better than I was, and I'm moving in that direction. And so I think my encouragement to most men is really, there's two things I tell every dad if he's willing to listen. One is, read more scripture. Probably, you're not the one dad who's over full of the Bible. Just, you know, I'm going to go out on a limb.
That's right.
And not you, Scott, but you listening.
That's right.
You probably don't have too much of that Bible all up in your head. More than likely, if there's any, you know, problem there, it's that you have too little. Read more scripture and ask better questions. Ask questions of yourself, your wife, your boys, your girls. Ask better questions. You just find you get all this clay out of their mind that you can work with, man. You can make all kinds of shapes with that. And for me, I'm still on that journey, like every other dad. You know, I'm trying to figure it out. I've got one son married. I've got one daughter-in-law, right? The last thing you want me is to pretend I'm an expert on adult children. Give me a break. But I am trying to figure it out, right? I'm gonna go to my son not too far from now, and I'm going to ask him, like, this is real time. This is not theoretical. And I'm going to say, hey, man, as an adult child, if I notice that you might be heading for the rumble strips of life, not like off the cliff, that's obvious.
Yeah, you're getting close,
But if I notice you're headed for the rumble strips, how do you want me to handle that?
What do you want me to do?
You want me to wait for you to ask? You want me to say nothing? You want me to put it in a text? You want me to call you? What do you want? Because I'll probably meet you wherever you are on that. I don't know. I don't even know if asking him that question is a good idea. But what I know is that's where I'm going to go next with him. Just so I can start to prepare for the adult life. And I'm asking other men whose kids are all out of the house, what did you do? You know, well, we both know our preacher at Southeast, Kyle, his dad, Ken Idleman, great guy. And I'm like, you know, Ken's in his 70s. And I'll go grab coffee with Ken. Because all of Ken's kids are out of the house. All of Ken's kids are grown. They've got grandkids. And he is 2 or 3 clicks down the road from where I am. And I'll ask Ken a bunch of questions about being a dad of adult children so that I can start to get a little wiser about that space as my kids start to leave the house. But man, I'm not ready to write the book on adult children. I can tell you that.
I'm going to steal that question today. So, well, hey man, those are great. Those are great takeaways for men who are listening today. So real quick, why don't you just kind of give us kind of a parting commercial, you know, how can men access what you're doing and participate in what you're doing?
Man, if there's any way we can serve you, I would say 2 things. One is if you have children in the home still and you want some resources either to do Bible study or you want to be a better father of kids in the home, go to manhoodjourney.org. Just go to manhoodjourney.org. You'll find all kinds of stuff there. Most of it's free. Secondly, if you'd like another podcast to listen to, head over to Father on Purpose. Me and my co-host Lawson, we talk about father stuff, and we talk about it specifically from how to be a godly biblical dad, not the the basics of oil changes and bow ties and 401ks. We're talking about how to be a godly dad. And so that's what we're doing today, man. Thanks for letting me come on the show. Dude. And by the way, again, back to where we started, I have a deep, deep love for Southland Christian Church because man, this is where I was baptized. It's the first time I ever heard really the gospel. First time I ever knew there was an Old Testament and a New Testament. No joke. I mean, all this is true. Monty Wilkinson, if you're out there listening, thank you, brother. He was the college-age pastor, 35 years ago.
Well, one of the things I love about that story with Monty is that you told him, like you said, dude, goodness. I'm really only here because this girl's really pretty and I'm just kind of chasing her. And Monty was like, well, there's there's higher levels of, thinking, but we'll take it.
I asked Monty if it was okay, and he goes, man, I'm not going to lie to you. There are higher motives. I mean, are you kidding? What a great answer. But back to that, he was one of the first religious professionals to show me grace.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated it. So, man, you Southland guys who are listening, you guys don't know how good you have it. Between Scott and John and the team here, God bless you guys for what you're doing, man. It matters. And in 31 years from now, you never know who'll be sitting in this chair, who's right here, right now, who's 19 years old, 20 years old, confused and misdirected. Man, seeds were planted years ago. We've reached 618,000 people on our website.
That's awesome.
Because I was baptized here 31 years ago.
Pretty cool.
Is that crazy?
Only God, right?
Seeds planted, right?
Yeah.
Seeds planted.
Yeah, man. Well, thank you. I'll be on your podcast here at some point, so I'm looking forward to that. So.
Oh, yeah. Turning the tables.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll come prepared. So, hey, man, thank you. Hey, as always, take an opportunity to share this podcast with people you care about and love, and we'll catch you next time on Locker Room. See y'all.